Welcome back. This unit will introduce you to the basic concepts, vocabulary, and terminology necessary for understanding the Survey of Western Art from 1300. This class surveys major artists, canonical works of art, and history from the 14th century to today. But before we can actually begin discussing the works of art themselves, we need to address the definition for exactly what is art and art history. This particular slideshow will introduce you to the definition of art, the definition of art history, and types of investigation into each of them, as well as the context in which art is made, and finally the definition of the different media used to create artworks. But before we even define art, we need to note a few particular things about what we now call art. Number one, according to UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, charged with defining, protecting, and conserving works of art throughout the world, they are going to note that over 60% of what we call art is actually found in Italy. 98% of all art in the entire world, in addition to this, is religious. So we might ask, why is so much art located in Italy, and why is art considered to be religious in its use, function, and application? Well, we will get to this, but obviously Italy is going to be the home to the Roman Empire, major patrons of the arts, as well as the Catholic Church, who again are going to take up the visual arts as a way in which to communicate their ideas. As far as the use of art, as we understand it, we must be careful, because the Western definition of art usually restricts this to media such as painting, sculpture, and architecture, as well as communicating a particular message. Now, in the definition that we choose for art, the object generally needs to be uniquely created by an individual and be a permanent fixture. This is new for all traditions, as other classes you will take here will show you in non-Western art, but all of which you'll notice are for religious purposes. Everything from Navajo sand painting to giant statues of the Buddha in Asia, again, all the way to the non-Western traditions and non-figurative traditions in Islam of mosque decoration, and then of Central and South America and Mesoamerican art, such as the Inca and the Maya. All of which, even though not made to be permanent, are going to be considered religious, and they serve a religious function. Next, if we have defined what art is globally, and as we understand it now, we can seek to identify it and define it more specifically. But we run into trouble. We find that what is art, right? If you look up art in the dictionary, you're going to get a rather generic definition, such as the quality, production, expression, or realm of what is beautiful or of more than ordinary significance. Now, for anyone who's trying to write down this definition, do not even bother, because if we try to define what are the limitations and the exact descriptions for what art is considered, you'll notice this is going to cover just about anything in human production and material culture throughout history. Everything from an ink pen to a computer mouse to, again, a television, all of which can be considered beautiful, right, aesthetically, and, of course, more than ordinary. Now, let's turn to a more specific definition that is useful for our terms in the history of art. So what is art? Well, according to Richard Anderson, one definition that is useful is going to be, art is culturally significant meaning, skillfully encoded in an affecting, sensuous medium. So what does this mean? Well, if we read it carefully, it's referring to the communication of ideas, right? So we're going to be communicating what a culture thought, what it was important to them, especially with concerns to social or religious ideas, right? But of course, we're not going to listen to any message unless it is appealing to us. And so we must have it encoded in a sensuous medium that is going to elicit a response from us, whether that be intellectual or emotional. Another way to understand this definition is that art is a reflection of culture, This is true all the way up until the 19th century and the Romantic movement. It is impossible that artwork, such as David's Oath of the Horatii seen here, cannot reflect the issues of the day, right? So, and this is leading up to the French Revolution, so we must consider that it reflects the politics of the day, so monarchy versus, again, more libertarian and egalitarian systems of government. Religion, right? So the French monarchy is Catholic. The belief system at the time, in this case, of course, is asking troops to sacrifice themselves for the good of France in general. And then hegemony, which is going to be the power systems in place in any given civilization, all of which can be seen in the artwork that they produce. Now, if I were to ask any of you what you think art is, the definitions I have heard over the past 10 years generally relate to a rather romantic tradition in the art world that is going to relate that art is the expression of an artist's experience, how they feel about something, and they're showing us this unique interpretation of the world, right? And we, of course, are going to revel in sharing that unique image of joy or pain, or jouissance. In this case, you have Suzanne Langer's definition. Art is the objectification of feeling, such as Edvard Munch here, that we'll get to in the Scream, showing us this reverberating scream echoing throughout nature until the artist himself begins screaming along. Definition, however, is going to give way in the 20th century to some of the more innovative works of art that confuse the general populace, and understandably so. Not everyone considers toilets and or urinals to be works of art, but they're still in museums, and we must ask why. Why are plumbing fixtures that were mass-produced utilitarian objects adopted as works of art? And the answer is quite simple. The artist says it's art. So this is a radical break that we will get to that occurred around World War I. And in movements such as Dada, you have Marcel Duchamp, right, going to be introducing these mass-produced objects that he finds to be beautiful, but it's because of the concept behind the work of art that it becomes art. And this is what works of art are going to develop towards in the post-industrial age, that being something that is going to be beautiful, right, but not necessarily specially handcrafted by an artist. So, as Donald Judd would say, if someone calls it art, it's art. This is going to be one of the fathers of minimalism. So, as an overview for what we'll be covering in this class, right, beginning roughly right before the Renaissance in the 14th century and running through the 21st century, we have three definitions of art that you should keep in mind. Right, number one, what is art? Well, from the dawn of time, and when man began creating works of art that we have remnants of from around 40,000 BCE onwards, all the way up until the 19th century, you must consider works of art to be a reflection of the culture that made them. Right? It is impossible that Matisse here with Fauvism could have made these arbitrary color choices prior to the early 20th century. Now, once we enter into the 19th century, from 1800 to 1970 roughly, with the birth of the post-industrial age, consider art to be the expression of the artist. That being, we have the view of the world as presented by the artist, him or herself. That's a way in which that they are understanding it and viewing it. Think of Van Gogh's Starry Night, right? So very expressive paintings. Now, once we reach 1970, we have the death of modernism as we know it, as we will get to, and the birth of the postmodern age, which coincides with the post-industrial age. This is when the exchange of ideas overcomes that of the production of commodities. So in this particular instance, you must understand art as the reflection of the artist, right, as or in culture. In other words, we no longer are looking to see the unique expression of an artist uniquely crafted as a genius. Instead, we demand that art is going to show us something about our world and communicate something of that world to us. Whether it's going to be the civil rights issues of the 1960s spilling over into the 70s, the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, or the culture wars of the 1990s. Art should show us something about society and how it might be bettered, and this still continues until today. Now that we've defined and shown you an overview of art and, of course, the chronology of art and how it develops and what it represents over time, we should now turn to how art is discussed, how we study it, how we classify it, how we investigate it. And this is going to be art history, right? So art history is the new discipline that came along at the same time as the post-industrial age and postmodernism. So art history is very different than the history of art, which is how this discipline was taught in the 1970s. So the history of art, as one might imagine, the history of jazz or the history of any type of music or literature, is going to lay things out in a chronological fashion, generally focusing on the positivist aspects of each one. So this is referred to as the chains of causality. So earlier on, this discipline was concerned with charting the progression, in this case, let's say Greek art, from the archaic period through the classical up until the Hellenistic, when the Romans are going to conquer Greece in 146 BCE. And as we see, we're primarily concerned with looking at the stylistic changes over time. Now, this is not going to be the same approach that we currently have with art history. Right, so now we are not as concerned with a chronological iteration of these different works that link up in chains as a solution to the next one. Now we're actually concerned with understanding the meaning of art within the original context, both from the point of view of the producers and consumers. All right, so it's this understanding of context that is so central to our full understanding of what the original creators and those that viewed these works thought. What were they intending? So in other words, the questions that we will be asking will be, how are these works of art used? How were they perceived by their intended audience? Who was the intended audience? Why were these works produced, right? So are they produced to be seen in a church, in front of a government building? Are they intended to sway you politically or in a religious fashion? They all are going to be communicating a message. So we need to ask what that message might have been and what the motivations of the artist and the patron may have been. And this leads us to patronage in general, which is who paid for it. You always want to follow the money. So if we follow the money, as in the example we're going to discuss here in a moment, we'll be able to see that the Opera del Duomo commissions Michelangelo to create his David, right? And that, of course, tells us what message they were intending to communicate. All right, now, before jumping into an interpretation of a very famous work that many of you have probably already seen, Michelangelo's David, a wonderful example of high Renaissance sculpture, a monumental Il Gigante, as the Florentines would say, we have to consider the three stages of investigation for all art historical inquiries. So just like any discipline, art history also has a way in which we look at works of art and objects in a predictable sequence, leading us from the most obvious qualities of a work to the abstract concepts and the cultural context requiring historical knowledge of a work of art. All right, so to begin, you have formal analysis. So to analyze the formal qualities of a work of art, in other words, we assess the physical properties. What is it made of? How big is it? What are the elements visually that communicate to us, and how does it communicate to us in a formal sense? All right, and we'll go through each one of these step by step. The next type of investigation is going to be iconography. So iconography is going to be when we define what is in the vernacular known as symbolism. That being, what does this work of art represent to people that look at it? That being the subject matter. And in this case, the subject matter will be that of the future King David. Finally, you have iconology. Iconology is going to ask us to investigate the cultural context in which something was produced. So in the example here, let's do a step-by-step analysis of Michelangelo's David that we can then apply to every work that we will discuss in this class. All right, so let's start off with formal analysis. So with formal analysis, all we are asking is the formal qualities. What are they like? What makes up the work? How did he create this 14-foot tall giant of a man? All right, so we would ask, of course, it's going to be marble, right? It's carved of marble, the subtractive method we will discuss here in a moment. We have the form that is fairly closed. His arms are once again pulled in towards the figure. The legs, of course, are going to form one solid line around the base to the stump that's going to be supporting his right leg, all the way up to his head as he looks off to his left. All right, so these are the questions we would ask. It is not painted, therefore it's left with the solid marble color, very clean, pristine, and very well polished. All right, but this is all we're asking at this stage of formal analysis, that being, what is it, right? So anyone in the world, regardless of their cultural traditions, religion, or background, would be able to look at this and see a large nude man, right? So everyone can agree that's what we're looking at. Now, it's going to be natural subject matter, right? The forms that we recognize from everyday experience. Everyone can agree with that. But if we were from another part of the world who was unfamiliar with the Christian tradition, then we would not, or a different time in history who was unfamiliar with this particular interpretation of technically a Hebrew biblical patriarch. So prior to Christianity, they might not identify this in the same way as later Christians would. This leads us to the second stage, right? So just to show you first off that anyone in this first natural subject matter interpretation would recognize that Rodin's The Thinker and Michelangelo's David are going to be large nude men. Right? There is no background information that we need to arrive at this interpretation. Moving on to step 2, the second phase of interpretation, though, we would refer to this as conventional subject matter. That being, at the time and place, what would people looking at this think? And since you have a nude figure holding a stone in his right hand and a sling over his left shoulder, looking off into the distance, people would naturally come to the conclusion that this is going to be the biblical patriarch David. All right, so what do we have that is common, that can be seen in many other examples, including that of Donatello's David, commissioned by the Medici and in their palace? Well, again, you're going to have a young nude figure showing that he has shed his armor given to him by Saul, the current king, so that he can show that God is on his side, that the righteousness of this young boy will prevail over the Philistine giant Goliath. Right? So anyone looking at this would have no problem interpreting the figure as David. Of course, then, in the third level or phase of interpretation, be interpreted further and in a special way according to the Florentines. So according to iconology, so whereas iconography is literally image writing, icon is image, graphos from the Greek is writing. Iconology, as you all know, with ology, is the study of images. So the study of images here are going to ask us to have some cultural context and historical background. And this is where we're asked to make an intuitive leap. All right, so we have a large, somewhat older David than had been seen before, and he is roughly 3 times the size of any David ever made. So why? Why do we see this heroic David? And the answer is the time in which it was created and where it was created, and that is the High Renaissance. So the Renaissance, as we will discuss, is going to be the rebirth, literally, is what Renaissance means, of Greco-Roman ideals. These ideas from history and the religion from the Greeks and the Romans in antiquity. These are revived beginning in the 14th century, actually, that will lead to this burgeoning interest in humanism, or a universe centered around that of man. right? Couple that with antiquarianism, which is the interest in ancient works themselves, so ancient statues, and you're going to get this heroic image of a superhuman, super heroic-like figure, because man is seen to be like God in the High Renaissance. And this will be the age that we get to where we have Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling with Adam being created by God. These very large, heroic, muscular figures in this way. Additionally, if we're looking at the intellectual historical context, we would note that in Florence, the city is going to, as the cradle of the Renaissance, identify itself with this figure of David, because like David, they see themselves as small, yet as righteous. So knowing that God will protect them and righteousness will prevail. So it becomes their particular figure that symbolizes the Florentine Republic. Thus, they will move this figure in front of the civic seat of power at the Palazzo Vecchio. All right, so just like he will later on paint the creation of Adam, this is giving us insight into the High Renaissance, right? So man as God. As the example of David demonstrates, context is very important for understanding a work of art. Today, if you go to museums, many people are familiar and are comfortable with seeing easel paintings and sculptures in large open areas isolated for viewing, right? So this notion of taking a work and placing it with other works of art solely for aesthetic contemplation and gratification or educational purposes is completely foreign throughout all of history. Museums are a nationalistic creation of the late 18th century with the birth of the French Republic and then of other national interests in Germany and other areas in the 19th century. So you find that museums isolate works of art from their original context, but to truly understand them, we must know where they came from, how they were originally seen. So most works, because they were created for religious purposes, would have been seen in religious contexts, such as chapels and churches, as seen here. Right, so context is very important, because if you have one's dead relatives buried below you, that is a very different experience and purpose when looking at a work of art than being in a class group, for instance, going to see a work in a museum. That's a sterilized context. Now, in order to understand works of art, along with where they were meant to be seen, we must again ask who paid for them. So the notion of patronage is very important for understanding works of art, because patrons controlled in a bespoke fashion what would be included and how things would be seen in works. In contracts, patrons would very clearly lay out what was intended, what the message would be, what it specifically should be included in these works of art. So as in the example of the Scrovegni Chapel we will look at next class, you have Enrico Scrovegni here, who is presenting the chapel in which we are standing looking at this, supported by a monk, while the three Marys give their blessing of appreciation to Enrico. All right, so the patronage and the importance of it here are undeniable. Now, the final thing to consider when it comes to, say, context and patrons is this notion of the artist. So when people say artists today, they generally conjure up the image of a lone genius working in their studio, much like Jackson Pollock, feverishly throwing paint on the floor, as in his case, or on an easel, right? But this notion of the lone genius creating in isolation his own ideas, or her own ideas, and their own message, is going to be a fairly recent invention. The notion of the artist working in a void, a vacuum, away from the public or patrons telling them what to do, is really a 19th century romantic invention again. Throughout most of history, and where we will begin in the Renaissance, so all of those famous artists you're familiar with, Michelangelo, Donatello, Leonardo, right, all of these famous artists are going to be working under the direct supervision and scrutiny of other individuals and patrons, in workshop settings as well. So they would be considered artisans, right? Not necessarily artists as we would understand them now, right? So much more akin to someone who is going to spend their entire lives trying to cultivate the skills to create something very unique, such as furniture, right? And or crown molding, right? Architecture, right? These are artisans. A very different idea than our modern one, the artist. Now, moving on, as with your handouts that all of you should have and be taking notes right now for each of the definitions, which are going to be on the exams and on the quizzes that follow these lectures, you should note that we will be testing on the definitions of iconography, iconology, formal analysis, as well as that of style and the definitions of media that follows. So style, very importantly, is a very slippery, indeterminate, and hard word to define. Right, so we can say that someone has style, we can say that it is in a particular style, but we really need to narrow down what we mean in art history when we say style. So style, as with music, fashion, cinema, anything you can imagine, is going to be that of visually distinct characteristics that are going to relate to a particular artist, region, or period. Now, what we mean by that is we can look at the way in which works are going to be laid out, how they were created, and what relates them, right? So visually, what is similar from one painting or sculpture to a next that tells us that this is, for instance, in this example, Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel ceiling? All right, so what are those elements and characteristics? But there are different types of style that help us discuss, right, the history of art. So, for instance, we have period style. So period style, as you might imagine, is going to be style that is common to a particular chronological period. So in this instance, the High Renaissance, as we've been discussing. So that period between roughly the turn of the 16th century to, once again, the death of Raphael in 1520. All right, so it's a very small, a very narrow window that has stylistic characteristics that will give us the final vision of humanism in the Renaissance, this perfect idea of man as God, of being able to control his. Now, we also have definitions such as personal style. So personal style is that relates to a particular artist, and this counts all the way through history until today. So for instance, we can look at the Mona Lisa and we can say that it is Leonardesque. So if you add esque or ian to the end of a word, it's going to mean that it is like Leonardo, right? So it's Leonardo-like, Leonardesque in this instance. So what is Leonardesque about the Mona Lisa? Well, he is going to paint a very specific type of chiaroscuro that we'll discuss later on, a tonal variation of light and shade known as sfumato, right? A kind of smoky, hazy light where he has veil after veil, one on top of another, of this type of foggy atmospheric effect in the background that blends again these different distant elements together. There are no hard lines in Leonardo, for instance, so we can easily identify his style. Now, another type of style is that of regional style. So a regional style, as you might imagine, is related to a particular region or geographical area. So if you are near a particular artist or within their sphere of influence, it's not surprising that you will paint in a particular fashion that is like those other artists, right? So if you're in Italy and you're near Michelangelo, you will paint like Michelangelo. If you're going to be in the north in the 15th century, for instance, you're going to paint like Jan van Eyck, the Flemish style, right? So in Flanders, an area that roughly is going to be the equivalent of modern day Brussels, for instance, you are going to find a style that is interested in textural illusionism, in including multiple layers of medieval symbolism, right? So very different from that seen in the heroic antique nudes of that of the Renaissance. And that's common to this one region, so a regional style. Now, having defined art history and its investigative techniques, and then of course the different types of style, let's move on now to the different types of media that we're going to see in this class. So media is plural for medium, just like you would say the media today if you're referring to a newspaper, television, or the internet, different ways in which to communicate ideas and images. So throughout the history of art, these various media, medium singular, are going to be used to communicate ideas, right, in this culture. But they all have the same thing in common in that you need a material, and then you need that material. So the most commonly cited medium in the history of art is that of painting. If I ask any of you to give me an example of a work of art, you most likely are going to think of images like the famous Mona Lisa, that being paintings that are going to be on an easel, for instance, on a wall, right? So you find that painting is going to be applying pigment, right, to a support, right? No matter what, there are various types of painting, but they all have this in common, right? So you find that the different types of painting where you're going to be applying a colored substance to a support, which can be, of course, a wall, a ceiling, canvas, right, a wooden panel, they're all going to have the same basic principles. All right, so they all have three things that make them up. You have the pigment, which is going to give the paint its color. You have the binder, which holds the paint together. And then you have the vehicle, which makes it move, right, which gives it its fluidity. All right, so to illustrate this, we give you tempera painting. So tempera, unless otherwise indicated, is the most common type of painting used until we get to the end of the early Renaissance, right? Roughly the end of the 15th century, right? So tempera has been used for thousands of years at this point. The ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans all used tempera painting, right? And tempera has, of course, qualities that make it very desirable up until this time. And that is, of course, that it is strong, it is durable, it has, of course, a matte-like lustrous finish, and it's abundant because it's going to be made of eggs. Right, so you find that many artists are going to be known as the chicken farmer because you need lots of chickens and eggs to make your tempera medium. Right, so you find that with tempera, you take the egg yolk and then mix it with your pigment, right? Whatever powder you grind up. So all painting up until the mid-20th century is going to be made of natural elements. It's not synthetic. So it's things that you find in the ground, naturally occurring elements, or charcoal, for instance. You grind it up, you mix it with this binder, and then you apply it on a surface. So that's going to be the vehicle which makes it move is going to be water, right? So that being so what do we get? A nice luminous matte surface, right? It's great for details such as hair, such as the folds of drapery, right? But the downside is it is fairly fast drying, so you can't work over it, and of course it's not translucent. It's very opaque, so once you add one layer you cannot see the layer underneath it. So there are drawbacks to tempera, but it is durable, it is long lasting, and it served its purpose for thousands of years. Now the other type of painting is going to be that of fresco, and this is going to be predominantly produced in Italy, in the Italian peninsula. So fresco is going to be known from antiquity. We have, again, thousands and thousands of yards of frescoes painted on the homes and businesses in Pompeii and Herculaneum in ancient Rome, for instance, buried in 27 Common Era. So the ancient Romans, the Egyptians, the Greeks all knew of fresco, but it will be the Italians in the period that we will be discussing, leading up until the Renaissance, who mastered this technique of painting on wet lime plaster. Right, so lime plaster, this is what the Sistine Chapel is going to be, how it was created and what it's made with. It's fresco, right? So it's adding a lime plaster to a wall, a masonry wall, and then painting on top of it. Basically painting watercolor that will then dry and fuse into the wall. All right, so the most durable and long-lasting form of fresco, which of course is Italian for fresh, is that of buon fresco. So buon fresco, or good fresh, or true fresco, is going to be used by the Italians. So the Italians master this type of painting on wet lime plaster. right? So this ensures that the pigment is going to be absorbed into the wall, thus becoming part of the wall itself, making it very durable and long-lasting. The only things that can destroy this type of fresco are going to be exposure to salt or moisture. Sunlight also will fade the pigment, but moisture will cause it to flake off. So as long as you paint these in a relatively dry area away from direct sunlight, they will last for thousands of years. The other variety of fresco is fresco secco, or dry fresco. So this type of fresco is going to be applied dry after the pigment has, or the fresco, I'm sorry, has dried. So this is really good for adding additional details on top of the fresco because it dries so rapidly. You have a very limited amount of time to work. So if you want to go back and add, for instance, seraphim, as are going to be seen here, right below the base of Christ, as you see the foreshortened Christ, the holy dove of the Holy Spirit, and God the Father. So they are fading because they were painted on after the fresco dried. Or eyelashes, or additional hair, or once again pupils. These items are going to be painted on later, thus they often flake off over time. Right? Moving on, the different types of application for frescoes are as follows. You need not know them in detail, but a rough idea is very important for understanding how these wonderful works of art were actually created, is that you begin with a masonry wall. So the masonry wall is just going to be a brick wall as we would understand it. Masonry means, again, stone. All right, so on top of the masonry wall, you have an auricchio layer. The auricchio layer is going to be a rough layer of plaster that's added to smooth out over the stone so it's not bumpy or irregular as a surface. Finally, you're going to add your intonaco layer, which makes it even smoother to ensure that you have a completely smooth surface. So this is the white layer of plaster that you would begin working on as an artist with many assistants helping you. So you find that you would come in one day, for instance, in the section D here, right, and add a giornata. Giornate, plural, are going to be the different sections of the fresco that are painted in a day. A giornata is a day's work. So in one day, we can paint this section as it dries. And thus, we can count how long or how many days it takes for an artist to finish something based on this jigsaw-like formation that occurs. Because you can never mix the same color of, say, sky blue or green for the grass day after day. There'll be slight variations. Right, and then just to show you, here's the previous giornata that we have here. Right, so you would draw in, before you begin working, a sinopia or a red chalk layer on the auricchio, and then cover each section. All right, so then this is going to dry in various stages. Now, you find that in order to prepare for frescoes, artists needed to make a design or a cartoon. This can then be transferred as a drawing in the form of contour lines or as a series of dots to the wall for an outline to trace. So here you have Michelangelo's self-portrait that he's going to include in his own work. Right? So before transferring it, you can see the tiny pricks around the contours, such as his nose and his brow here. So this is going to then be pressed on the wall, and then through the Spolvero technique, a bag of chalk will be pounded against it, leaving an outline of these tiny dots, which can be incised and brought together as an outline for the fresco once it is completed. So here you can see the different giornata, right, in a day's work. So you can complete large areas of blue if that's all you're painting in that day. Whereas the smaller sections that take a lot more detail, such as heads, will be allotted an entire day, or hands will be given an entire day because they take so much detail and are time consuming. Right. Now, the next variety of painting that is very famous, because that's what the Mona Lisa is going to be painted in, is that of oil. So oil painting will take the place of tempera, beginning roughly in 1430 in Flanders with Jan van Eyck, and will be the dominant panel painting or easel painting medium up until the mid-20th century. A very, very popular medium. and we will explain why. So why for 500 years does everyone love oil? And the answer is as follows, right? Oil, unlike tempera, is going to use as its binder oils, right? Linseed, walnut, or poppy seed oils that are going to contain the pigment, but it is very slow drying, unlike tempera. So you find that with oil, here's an example of Jan van Eyck, the man credited with the creation of oil painting by Giorgio Vasari, who is going to write the biographies of the great Italian artists. So you find that they begin mixing this linseed oil from the flax plant and then applying it to a wooden panel starting off that's been covered with gesso or a white primer, right, to make it smooth. So what are the advantages here? Well, the advantages of oil are that it has greater covering power, so over time it doesn't fade and reveal what is painted underneath like tempera. It has at the same time greater transparency. You can add layers and layers of transparent or translucent glazes that show through the colors that were painted underneath. Because it dries so slowly, you can make changes, very gradual, subtle, very supple changes. So with these glazes, you are able to suggest, for instance, the liquid in the eyeball, the reflective quality, the pupil inside of an iris, the stubble, right, that's going to be covering the surface of the man's face, or the blood that is right underneath the surface of the skin, giving it a more lifelike quality instead of a matte, flat quality. This is what oil allows you to do. Now, you find that oil is going to be painted on wooden panels up until we get to the end of the 15th century when Venetian painters begin replacing wooden panels with canvas. Now remember that Venice is a maritime power, and so they are going to have a great experience with sails and working with this type of canvas that rolls up. So they realize that because Venice is on water, if you use oil painting, it's going to be much more flexible than tempera is, and if you have it painted on a flexible backing like canvas, it will also resist cracking in very moist areas like that of Venice, where you have water everywhere. So you find that you can make massive paintings now, right? 30-foot wide paintings are the size the Venetians really like, such as the Last Supper here. You can roll them up and then ship them anywhere you want around the world. And that's what the Venetians are known for, is oil painting on canvas and their maritime empire where they ship. Now, canvas that we're more familiar with today, so any major modern work of art that you're familiar with is likely painted on canvas. That of Jackson Pollock's, right? So action paintings to Kandinsky, to Matisse, to, again, any of the Impressionists, they're painting on canvases, right? So there's different types of weaves with canvas. You have that of a rough weave or a smooth weave. So this will give you a kind of bumpy texture, a braille-like texture, to where you can gently drag your brush over the surface and it will pick up these highlighted sections if you want. Or press the brush very hard on the surface and it will penetrate deeply into these different woven layers, right? So we can have different effects in this way, lighting effect. The last form of painting that we will discuss is that of acrylic, coming along in the second half of the 20th century, widely adopted by artists and still very popular by amateur artists and in schools, for instance, today. Why? Because unlike oil, whose vehicle is turpentine or a solvent, which of course leaves, it's flammable, number one, but it leaves, again, an odor that is difficult to get off. You find that acrylic, being a synthetic polymer resin, is going to use water as its vehicle. So it's fast drying and it also will maintain the color over time, given that it is synthetic instead of using natural materials. I just show you David Hockney here as an example, but any late 20th century painting is likely made with acrylic if you. Now, what can you do with acrylic? Well, since you find that your resin binder is transparent here, you retain the color's intensity longer, and as it dries, it doesn't darken like that of oil. And you can also treat it much like watercolor, as Helen Frankenthaler did, right? And dump it on the surface, diluted with various degrees of water, and it will show you various degrees of transparency, from the areas that are not diluted hardly at all to those that are mostly, once again, diluted, and very little of the acrylic actually remains, with the kind of watercolor effect that you see here. All right, so greater range of application, and of course dries much more rapidly than that of oil, right? So it dries incredibly fast and has. Now, unlike painting, sculpture is three-dimensional. So three-dimensional works of art, known as sculpture, are often created by either carving and or adding materials, right? So we can either subtract materials in stone or wood, or we can add them like in clay or a substitutive method with metal. All right, so sculpture will always be the sum of its surfaces and profiles, right? So do we walk around it? Is it going to be projecting from a flat background? How do we engage with it is generally the question. So we have the most common type, or famous type, I should say, of sculpture that you're familiar with, such as Michelangelo's David, freestanding sculpture. So freestanding sculpture is meant to be seen in the round. We're supposed to walk around it. It is not generally going to be attached to a wall or a surface. Thus, it's going to command an understanding of volumetric surfaces, shapes, and properties. The other variety, which perhaps you come in contact with more often on a daily basis if you have coins in your pocket, is that of relief sculpture. So relief sculpture is not freestanding, and in fact projects from a background surface, such as bas-relief, right? So to give you an example. In this case, we show you the Gates of Paradise that we will discuss, commissioned from Lorenzo Ghiberti for the baptistry in Florence. But you can see that none of the figures are completely in the round. They are always attached to the back. Now, there are two varieties of relief sculpture, that of low relief and high relief. Low relief sculpture is going to project only slightly from the surface. Thus, it does not cast very dramatic shadows, right, and is not nearly three-dimensional, such as what you see here with the miracle of the believing donkey with Donatello, right, from San Antonio in Padua. All right. High relief sculpture, on the other hand, is very dramatic and is designed to project more than half from the background. So more than half of the circumference is going to be a modeled form that projects from the surrounding surface. So with high relief sculpture, you will cast very deep shadows. It is almost always used for dramatic action scenes, such as François Rude here and the Departure of the Volunteers of 1792 on the Arc de Triomphe in France. Now, to create either one of these, either freestanding or relief sculpture, you can use different methods. One is that of the substitution method, or substitutive method, of casting. So with casting, we're substituting one material, generally an impermanent material like clay, for a more permanent one like bronze. All right, so then we can still reproduce the same effect of how it was created, such as the supple, malleable appearance of, or pliable appearance of clay, like the Thinker by Rodin. Now, the most long-lasting and prized and treasured type of substitutive casting is that of lost wax casting, otherwise known as bronze hollow casting. Now, bronze hollow casting has been known since antiquity, first, of course, adopted by the late Sumerians and Akkadians, and then, of course, the Greeks will become masters of bronze hollow casting, and they revived this tradition in the Renaissance with great artists like Donatello and Benvenuto Cellini. All right, so in this instance, you're going to create an original, and then you will destroy it in the process. So you only have one final product instead of the multiples. So how do we do this? We begin with making a mold, all right, and or a clay figure that you want to see in the final product. So you build it up in an additive fashion like out of clay. You then are going to either break the figure figure apart into different sections or cover it all with wax. Right, so once covered with wax, right, you then are going to bury it and turn it upside down. So once buried and upside down, you pour your molten metal into the areas where the wax is going to be located. So being wax, this will melt, right, with the high temperature of molten bronze, for instance, and replace the thin layer of wax around the figure. You then take it out, break all of the dirt and everything else that would have accumulated around it off, and polish it. And you are then given a final product. So again, what do we do, such as with Rodin's process and or Donatello's process, is we create a clay. You then cover it in wax, bury it in the ground, right, and then pour molten metal, right? So the molten metal is going to replace the wax in this thin shell around the clay mold. Then, as you see here, you wouldn't see the figure. It would be in the ground, right? It would be in the ground to contain the immense heat so it doesn't explode, even though very often the kilns to melt this metal did explode, killing many people. Cellini is a good example of this. His pupils suffered many injuries. Now, after cooling, you'll take it out and then polish it, and thus you will be left with this thin layer of bronze all the way around the figure. All right, so it's a very durable, a very lightweight, and a very strong tensile strength. Right. All right. Now the other variety preferred by Michelangelo is the substitutive method, otherwise known as carving. This is most common with wood or stone. Now, the Italians preferred marble, Carrara marble in the case of Michelangelo, and you will subtract or take away from the elements you do not want in the final. So this is very challenging. Unlike the additive method, there's no second chances. There's no room for error, because once you cut off a section, such as someone's arm or nose, you cannot glue it back on. It is gone forever. So you must constantly be visualizing this figure, struggling to get out of a block of marble, as Michelangelo explains, the entire time you are carving, over months or years, imagining where the back of his head will be, where the back of his arm will be, and keep that in mind in 3 dimensions while you are working continuously. Finally, we have architecture. Architecture in the Trinity of the Fine Arts, finalized by Giorgio Vasari in the Renaissance of painting, sculpture, and architecture, is, of course, both the process and the product, right, which is interesting. So you find that in architecture, there are a few things we will keep in mind while proceeding here, and the issues that plague architects throughout all of history. All architects have to consider the same 3 things, and this is what is going to make architecture unique. As all of you know, the wonderful axiom of form follows function. That being number 1, what is its function? What is its use? Is it a church? Is it a residence? Is it a library? Is it a palace? What is it supposed to do? Secondly, you consider, after the function, what will its form be like? Because the form is supposed to reflect the function. So do we have a wide open, long, longitudinal area to fit people of a congregation to watch a priest? Do we have narrow corridors to allow us to traverse passageways and palaces? Do we have, again, areas for monks to write and read, again, books and scriptoria? So what does it look like? And then finally, how does it stand up, right? So how does it actually support its own weight and accomplish the first 2 of the... All right, so next time, be sure to have your outline and handout ready because we will also begin the 14th century in Italy and talk about the precursors of the Renaissance, right? That of Giotto di Bondone and Duccio di Bolsena. Right, so you find that Giotto and Duccio are going to represent very important artistic traditions that will lay the groundwork and the foundations for the Renaissance, that are interested in humanism and, again, mathematical space, consistently cast light, volumetric figures, and, of course, easily understood narratives. All right, until next time.